Ever come across someone whose emotional awareness is so sharp that simply being near them feels like nothing about you can stay hidden? That's what people often describe as a super empath. They don't just understand emotions, they absorb them, process them, and respond with a level of depth that can feel almost unsettling to those around them. Their love is real, intense, and deeply intentional, but that doesn't make them blind or easy to manipulate. Now, imagine this kind of person entering a relationship with someone emotionally avoidant, someone who instinctively pulls away from closeness, who retreats the moment things start to feel too intimate or too real. At the beginning, the avoidant often feels untouchable. They appear composed, self-contained, even a little mysterious. And in that space, they believe they hold the control because they decide how close is close enough. But over time, something begins to change in ways they don't immediately recognize. The super empath, calm and emotionally grounded, slowly starts to disrupt the very structure the avoidant relies on. Not through conflict, not through confrontation, but through awareness, through presence, through not playing the same emotional game anymore. And this is where the shift quietly begins. Avoidant dynamics usually follow a predictable pattern. One person pulls back, the other pursues. One creates distance, the other tries to bridge it. That rhythm gives the avoidant a false sense of control, as if emotional closeness can always be managed by simply stepping away when things get uncomfortable. But a super empath eventually starts to see this pattern for what it is. At first, they may still reach out. They may still try to understand, to connect, to soften the emotional distance. They may even believe that enough patience or care can make the avoidant feel safe enough to stay present. Then reality slowly settles in. They begin to understand that you can't pour love into someone who refuses to hold it. You can't repair what the other person is not willing to acknowledge. And most importantly, they realize that constantly chasing emotional connection in one direction isn't love. It's depletion. So something within them shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. They stop over-explaining. They stop initiating every conversation. They stop asking repeated questions like, "Are we okay?" Instead, they begin to respect silence instead of trying to fix it. Their energy starts to turn inward, back toward themselves. And this change is what unsettles the avoidant the most. Because the empath was the consistent presence, the one who stayed open, the one who softened the emotional distance, the one who made things feel stable even when the avoidant was withdrawing. And now that steady presence starts to fade, not out of anger, not out of punishment, but out of self-respect. This isn't abandonment, it's reclamation. The empath is no longer over-investing in someone who only meets them halfway when it suits them. They're no longer available in the same unrestricted way. And that shift breaks the familiar emotional rhythm the avoidant depended on. Suddenly, there's no one filling the silence, no one chasing, no one repairing every emotional gap, and that absence speaks louder than any argument ever could. The avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Their usual sense of emotional control starts to weaken. Thoughts begin to surface. Why did they stop reaching out? Did I push them away? Did I lose something I assumed would always be there? That empty space left behind becomes louder than words ever were, because now they are left alone with what they've spent so much energy avoiding: emotional responsibility, vulnerability, and the reality of genuine intimacy. The empath's withdrawal is not performative. It is not a strategy designed to provoke a reaction. It is clarity. It communicates without saying a word. I understand what this dynamic is, and I will no longer lose myself inside it. It's not about playing games. It's about restoring peace. And for someone who has built emotional walls as protection, The quiet absence of someone who truly cared can feel far more confronting than any emotional confrontation ever could. A super empath also has another powerful trait. They reflect rather than chase. They don't accuse. They don't force conversations. Instead, they mirror the emotional reality being given to them. If the avoidant withdraws, the empath stops overextending. If communication becomes inconsistent, the empath responds with the same level of consistency. Not to punish, not to manipulate, but to bring balance back into something that has become one-sided. And that reflection is what disrupts everything. Because avoidant individuals often maintain emotional distance while still relying on their partner to keep the connection alive. But when the empath stops compensating for that distance, the imbalance becomes undeniable. The avoidant expects pursuit. They expect emotional follow-up. They expect reassurance chasing them. Instead, they get calm neutrality. And that neutrality is what throws them off completely. For the first time, there is no emotional buffer protecting them from the consequences of their own detachment. There is no one smoothing over the gaps, just silence meeting silence, distance meeting distance. And in that reflection, they are forced to see exactly what they've been creating all along. This is what makes the empath's presence so powerful even in absence. They don't amplify drama, they remove distortion. They don't exaggerate emotion, they reveal truth. At some point, the avoidant may feel discomfort or irritation. They might even interpret the shift as coldness or detachment. But what they are actually experiencing is something they are not used to: emotional clarity without interference. Because now, there is no one adjusting themselves to keep things comfortable. The empath has stopped managing emotional avoidance. They are simply responding to reality as it is, not as it was hoped to be. And that changes everything. Super empaths are also natural space holders. In the early stages, they are often the emotional grounding force in the relationship. They are patient. They are understanding. They give time for growth, for healing, for opening up. They don't rush emotional development, and they don't punish emotional fear. But patience is not infinite. And when they realize that their openness is being met with avoidance instead of growth, something inside them quietly redefines the boundaries of what they are willing to carry. They don't leave with drama. They don't threaten. They simply shift. Where they once reached out, they pause. Where they once initiated emotional repair, they observe. And where they once filled silence, they let it remain untouched. That silence becomes the final mirror. And in that mirror, the avoidant finally sees what has always been there, but never fully faced. And when that silence lingers, the empath doesn't immediately try to fill it anymore. They stay with it too, but this time for themselves. Not as a response to the other person, but as a return to their own emotional space. They start to respect the limits of their own capacity. They begin to understand that endlessly holding space for someone who refuses to meet them halfway isn't compassion. It slowly becomes a form of self-erasure. There comes a point where a super empath, after being met with consistency, care, and patience in return for their own openness, finally says, "This isn't working for me." And when they say it, it carries a different weight. It isn't impulsive. It isn't reactive. It isn't meant to hurt anyone. It's the outcome of long observation, quiet disappointment, and emotional exhaustion that was processed in silence long before it was ever spoken. That kind of boundary doesn't create chaos. It creates emptiness, because suddenly, the avoidant partner is no longer surrounded by the emotional safety net they became used to. The empath is no longer overextending, no longer filling every gap, no longer softening every silence. What once felt like emotional stability is now gone, not because it was taken away, but because it was no longer sustainable to give it. The avoidant may not see it coming. From their perspective, nothing dramatic happened. There was no fight, no final confrontation, no visible breaking point. But that's exactly what makes it so impactful. The empath didn't leave in anger. They simply stopped abandoning themselves. They weren't ignored. They were observing. They weren't silent because they didn't care. They were waiting to see if the relationship would ever become mutual on its own. And when it became clear that it wouldn't, they made a different choice. They chose themselves, not as retaliation, not as punishment, but as alignment. And that decision often unsettles the avoidant far more than any argument ever could. Because it doesn't come with emotion to react to. It comes with certainty. A super empath naturally has the ability to feel what others feel, even when it isn't expressed clearly. They're often the first to soften tension, the first to understand emotional withdrawal, the first to interpret distance as fear instead of rejection. In relationships with avoidants, this makes them incredibly patient at first. They don't rush vulnerability. They don't force emotional exposure. They give space, time, and understanding. But that same sensitivity can also lead them into a pattern of over-responsibility. They begin to internalize emotional imbalance. They start asking themselves what they did wrong, even when the distance had nothing to do with them. The avoidant, on the other hand, often struggles with emotional closeness and discomfort. So when things start to feel intense, they withdraw, minimize, or deflect. And slowly, a cycle forms. The empath reaches. The avoidant retreats. The empath questions themselves. The avoidant avoids accountability. And without realizing it, the empath begins carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. At first, they try harder. They adjust. They become more gentle, more patient, more understanding, hoping that if they just approach love in the right way, the distance will disappear. But over time, something becomes clear. No amount of emotional effort can replace mutual participation. That realization changes everything. The super empath begins to recognize the pattern. Every time emotional discomfort arises, it gets redirected. Every time they express hurt, it gets softened into, "You're too sensitive," or "You're reading too much into it." And over time, something inside them shifts. They stop absorbing what isn't theirs. It doesn't happen loudly. It happens in silence, in restraint, in the decision not to over-explain anymore. In the moment they stop chasing clarity from someone who keeps avoiding it. In the instant, they no longer argue when their feelings are dismissed. They simply disengage. When the avoidant says, "You're overreacting," there is no longer a debate. When avoidance shows up as sarcasm or withdrawal, there is no longer pursuit. There is just recognition. This is not mine to fix. And that shift is deeply destabilizing for the avoidant. Because the dynamic they relied on, where emotional distance was always met with emotional pursuit, no longer exists. The empath is no longer compensating, no longer repairing, no longer cushioning emotional avoidance. What remains is the truth of the dynamic, without interference. At that point, the avoidant is left with something unfamiliar. The full impact of their own emotional absence. No reaction to redirect. No emotional escalation to control. Just space. And in that space, clarity begins to form. Uncomfortable, unavoidable clarity. This is often when the empath quietly steps into full self-prioritization. Not in response to a single event, but as the result of many unspoken moments layered over time. Moments of being dismissed, moments of being misunderstood, moments of being emotionally alone while still in connection. They didn't leave because they stopped caring. They left because continuing to stay in that pattern would mean abandoning themselves completely. And that's the real turning point. Avoidants are often used to being met with persistence, people who stay even when they withdraw. So they assume that dynamic will always continue. But what they don't expect is that the same emotional depth that made the empath stay so long is exactly what allows them to finally walk away with clarity. Not to prove anything, not to create regret, but simply because staying would cost too much. And this shift doesn't happen in reaction to one moment. It accumulates slowly, over missed emotional bids, over repeated misunderstandings, over silence that was never addressed. Eventually, the empath realizes they are not in a balanced connection. They are in a cycle of emotional waiting. And once that becomes clear, something internal resolves. The avoidant may later ask, "Why now?" or "Why did you leave?" But the answer isn't in a single explanation. It's in everything the empath stopped doing. No more overextending. No more emotional translation. No more carrying the relationship alone. Just distance. Just clarity. Just self-respect. And that absence is often what impacts the avoidant most. Not because of conflict, but because of peace. Because the person who always stayed, always understood, and always adjusted is no longer available in that role. The empath didn't become cold. They became complete again. And for many avoidants, that is the moment the realization finally lands. Not just that someone left, but that someone was willing to stay fully present, until they were no longer willing to disappear for someone else's comfort. So the real truth is this: when a super empath enters the life of an avoidant, it isn't just a relationship dynamic. It becomes a reflection, a slow unveiling, a quiet confrontation with patterns that can no longer hide behind emotional distance. Not through force, not through pressure, but through awareness, patience, and eventually boundaries that speak more clearly than words ever could. A super empath never sets out to dismantle anyone's defenses. They simply stop dismantling themselves to keep those defenses comfortable. And in that moment, everything shifts. To those who recognize themselves in the empath, your depth is not your flaw. Your ability to feel is not your weakness. It becomes your strength the moment you stop using it against yourself. And to those who recognize themselves in avoidance, sometimes what feels like loss is not punishment, it is reflection. A moment where silence finally shows you what presence used to cover. This is the space where real growth begins, not in blame, but in awareness. This has been The Silent Soul. In the end, the empath doesn't leave in anger, but in clarity. They stop abandoning themselves to sustain one-sided connection. And when they finally choose their own peace over emotional imbalance, the silence they leave behind becomes the avoidant's clearest mirror, revealing what was lost only after it was taken for granted.